Hi, my name is Andrew Taylor, and I'm here with my business partner, Ali Harding Taylor, and we are presenting some of our thinking around the psychology of exits and moving business owners to action. And I want to start with a quote that is very familiar to us and we think really encapsulates much of the concepts that we're going to talk about in the next 15 minutes or so. Investment bankers and generally people who work with entrepreneurs would do well to heed the complex drama playing the inner world of these people. They will profit by looking below the surface of things. And so we're going to take you on a little bit of a dive below the surface and get to understand a little more about what makes entrepreneurs tick and why actually exit and transition for them is in many ways one of the most challenging phases of their professional career, and what the implications are for you as advisors and consultants to business owners. I want to start with a little bit of a story. I had a call a few months back from a business advisor, M&A banker in central Canada. And he had a business owner had come to him, and he was in his early 70s, and he was stating all the words that seemed to make sense for his life stage. 25 million some odd business, had a somewhat of a health scare recently, was really thinking about selling the business, and wanted this investment banker to go out and find him a buyer. So Mr. Investment Banker, being a good advisor, went out and did as the owner described and brought some buyers to the table, and in this case it was the lunch table at a local restaurant, where he expected the buyer, who had agreed to all the initial conditions and terms and offering of $25 million for the business, to show up enthusiastically. Instead, an hour or so before the meeting was due to happen, the business owner called the advisor and said, "Look, I've had something come up at work and I won't be attending," and then proceeded to go missing in action for the next month or so. Mr. Investment Banker was obviously confused by that and gave us a call and asked for our input. Because at Orange Kiwi, Ali and I's expertise is in the area of the psychology of business owners at the point of transition. And so we asked the advisor to get the owner to take an assessment, which he did. And one of the questions in there that I think really speaks to this point is a question about, I am more fulfilled by business relationships than I am personal relationships. Many of us would say we might be somewhere in the middle, that work is important for us, but it's not everything. But for this particular business owner, and you might have picked this up by now, you might know where I'm heading, stated that it was a very strong relationships were much stronger for him than his personal relationships. And suddenly I've seen just people understand this whole concept when they see this story played out, because suddenly $25 million, all the deal terms, all the money in the world, suddenly is not as quite as significant or as essential to the conversation as maybe it had been previously, because this owner, as they were getting to the verge of selling their business, were realizing, even if subconsciously, that they were selling these 25, 30, 35 years worth of relationships, and they actually didn't have much relational equity and strength outside of their business. And it's these kind of factors that we describe as happening below the surface for the business owner. And so it's understanding what's happening below the surface can be critical insights for helping professional advisors work with entrepreneurs better. And before I ask Ali to speak to some of those psychological factors going on below the surface, I want to introduce you to sort of a platform for how we think generally about owners' transitions and exits. We've taken this from a good friend of ours known as Bo Burlingham. He has a book called Finish Big: How Great Entrepreneurs Finish on Top, or exit their businesses on top. And he describes through his anecdotal research with a number of business owners 4 critical phases that he saw repeated over and over again that, if completed successfully, led to much greater opportunity for that exit to be ultimately successful for the business owner, because our belief is that transaction is not the ultimate definition of success. It's being able to move through to a life of success and significance beyond the business is what ultimately the business owner will measure as successful. And so he starts with this phase of exploration. And by that we mean answering the big questions. Who am I without my business? What do I really want? Who do I care about? And what should I do I think they should get out of this process? What are my values? What am I prepared to give up on? What am I prepared to hold the line on? What are the critical, essential things that I want to achieve in and through this process? That leads in many cases to a strategic process. And that's beginning to think about the business as a product to be sold as opposed to the business owner's life work, asset, main professional expression, whatever other bucket that falls into. It's important that owners begin to think about preparing their business for sale, much like a house owner needs to think about their house as an asset to be sold when thinking about going to market, not just their place of residence. The third phase is the one that much of the industry around this stage of a business's life is that of execution. And by that we mean the deal. It's the negotiations, it's the due diligence, it's the process of getting the deal done. And most often when people talk about exit, they're actually referring to this execution phase. And the fourth phase is what we call adjustment. Bo calls it transition. We call it adjustment. It can be a multi-year. In fact, in most cases, it is a multi-year process where the business owner moves to a place of success and significance outside of their business identity and business career. And in many cases, that is incredibly difficult for owners because everybody's been congratulating them for selling their business, in many cases for many millions of dollars, and yet often they feel empty and unfulfilled. So these 4 phases, if done, are essential for a successful transition. What we find, however, is that these phases look a little more like this. That is, that they overlap and interweave with one another. And that the strategic process of preparing my business for sale bleeds into execution. Execution bleeds into adjustment because adjustment should be happening before any transaction is signed. And the point that I want to particularly focus on here is this idea of exploration. In our experience, many business owners their first conversations about exit and transition is around the idea of execution, the deal. They get approached by an investment banker or a business consultant about building up their business to sell it. And too often, or they get asked about wealth planning and tax management and insurance planning and those kind of things which are more technical and execution in nature. In most cases, we find business owners simply step over or are never offered the opportunity to truly understand those exploratory type questions that I mentioned previously. What happens as a result is that those questions go unanswered or unasked and thus unanswered, and tend to raise their ugly head all the way through the subsequent phases. And that plays out in just as that story I described earlier with that business in Canada, that he had never answered some of those exploratory questions like, who am I without my business? Who do I care about? Who do I love? Who's important to me? And therefore, how do I think about that? Instead, he had been forced or had chosen to go to the execution stage, and those questions effectively played themselves out in real time in terms of deal negotiations, or in this case, lack thereof. And business value can be destroyed. Advisors get incredibly frustrated, and exit and transition fails to happen well for business owners. And in worst case, that business owner, if he doesn't answer those kind of questions, ends up maybe 10, 15 years down the track in his late 80s, still holding on to the business and potentially having watched the value of the business collapse through the process, and or any transition is really poorly handled. So in light of those phases I want to transition this over to Allie and ask her to take you below the surface, so to speak, into some of the key characteristics that make up the owner's psychology, and then we'll do a wrap with how that works out in terms of how wealth management can work with business owners, and more specifically, some of our work with Capital One.
So when we talk about going below the surface, there are three aspects of human personality that we look at. One is motivations. Motivations are deep psychological drivers that must be satiated in order for a person to feel satisfied and effective in the world. The first motivational driver, when we talk about this concept of self-determination theory, is called autonomy. And autonomy is the concept of being able to control your own future and design your own way forward in the world, having the freedom to make choices and decisions and control your life. The second motivational driver is this concept of relatedness, and that's the ability to care for others and be cared for by others. And that's a relational need that for business owners is often met primarily through their business. They spend more time with their employees than they do with their family. The third motivational behavior that is very important for entrepreneurs is this concept of competency, or a sense of being effective in the world and being able to achieve success and have strength and be able to operate confidently in your environment. These three motivational drivers for entrepreneurs must be satiated in order for them to derive psychological health. And they often do it in certain ways because of the way that they're wired, some personality dimensions called characteristics. And these characteristics are hardwired into a business owner. They're very resistant to change. It's a core of who they are. And more than 35 years of entrepreneurial research has helped us to identify 5 critical characteristics of successful entrepreneurs. The first characteristic is something called risk-taking propensity. Now, this isn't a business owner going to Vegas and betting everything on red or black or on a roulette wheel. Rather, it's their tendency to take risks that they believe are prudent that other people would think are completely crazy. So one example is their business is struggling. They have some cash flow issues. They go out and mortgage their house and dump all their cash into their business with no guarantee they'll ever get it back out. So they put all their eggs into one basket. Most advisors or lenders would balk at this as an overly risky proposition. Entrepreneurs will mortgage their home 2.5 times during the life of their business on average to be able to see their business grow and thrive. For them, they eat risk for breakfast. And that's in part because they have this tolerance for ambiguity. And that's the sense of them not needing a detailed plan. They don't have to know what's around the next corner. Every single time they reach a new level of success, they're entering uncharted waters. And they have to navigate their way through those uncharted waters. And with every successful attempt at managing and navigating uncertainty, their tolerance for ambiguity grows. And this is in part because of their high ability to innovate just-in-time solutions and their need for creativity and their belief in their own ability to solve challenges and seize opportunities that other people simply don't see or completely miss. And when you take these 3 personality traits and you combine it with something called goal achievement or a need for goal achievement, what you have are entrepreneurs who are constantly pushing the edge. They're never going to settle for second best. They're never going to adopt somebody else's goals. So when a banker or a wealth planner or an attorney comes to them and says, you really need to mitigate risk, or you really need to plan for exit, or you really need to do X, Y, and Z, if it's not the owner's goal, if he's not intrinsically motivated or internally motivated to achieve that goal, it's just not going to happen. And that's in part because of this fifth characteristic. And this is the one where everybody goes, oh, yeah, need for control. And they look at the owner as if that's a bad thing. Like these control freaks drive advisors nuts. But in reality, this need for control is essential for making an entrepreneur successful. It's managing the details, managing every facet of that business so that they can push through barriers and obstacles that crush other people. The need for control combined with the other four characteristics gives them a sense of resilience to push through and lead their business to new levels of success. So this concept of motivations and characteristics combine to form a certain set of behaviors. And these behaviors are the outward expression of all of their motivations and characteristics being lived out through their business. And what happens as their motivations are met through their business and their wiring is expressed through their business is they tend to adopt something called role identity fusion. Now, this is the concept of a person having their self-identity, that's who they are in the world, and then this thing called a role identity, that's who they are as the owner of their business. For some people, they have very good separation between these two worlds, and they can move in and out of those roles very easily. It doesn't cause them any distress, and they're able to operate really successfully in both realms. But for most successful business owners, as their business grows and their psychological wiring is lived out through their business and their motivations are satiated, they tend to get their self-identity fused with their role identity. And pretty soon they literally do not know who they are apart from their role, which makes the concept of significant changes and transitions to their business all that much more difficult. The other thing that happens is the way that they solve problems and their openness to change starts to shift. So while entrepreneurs tend to be wildly innovative and creative problem solvers, as their business grows, they don't want to revisit places they've been before. They don't necessarily have a desire to build new systems and processes. They're interested in innovating in areas that drive the business forward. So for some owners who live on either end of a continuum called adaptation to innovation, at those ends, it gets very difficult for them to embrace successful change. So a highly adaptive owner, or an owner with an adapter style, makes very small changes based on things that are tried and true, and they aren't really going to be very open to new people coming in and exploring their business. But equally true on the other end, owners who have high innovator problem-solving styles and openness to change are constantly out blazing new trails. It's hard to get their attention and focus them on anything. They're running, creating, generating new opportunities. And so to get them to think about walking away from their business or doing something different in their business is an anathema to them. It's somewhere in the middle, just to the right of this innovator side, so just to the middle of center, where we really get owners who are able to embrace change and innovate and adapt and have strength in that area. The cool thing about these behaviors is behaviors are open for change, and we can measure them. So a great example would be a family that I met at Capital One's first Finish Big Owners Forum last June 2016. And this family, a very dynamic family, have a business that has an enterprise value of about $28 million. And they had been working with private equity and had been to what we call the altar about 3 times, exploring this thing called generational transition and business exit. And when we assessed them, we got to understand what the below the surface tensions were. And we were able to more effectively work with their wealth manager and Capital One's wealth strategist and their business banker and put an investment banker in play and come to the table and help them really understand what they wanted for their business transition. We say what they wanted for mom, their money, ownership, and management of the business, and help them design exit scenarios that they felt really comfortable with and help them take control of their transition instead of their transition them being responsive and reactive to inquiries. They were now in control and able to drive it. And that came completely as a result of the Finish Big Owners Forum and Patrick Doyle's innovative vision for bringing new ways of helping business owners into his practice and working with colleagues at Capital One in the retail and business banking divisions to help them identify business owners who may not have liquid wealth today, but have strong potential for liquid wealth in the future, and may along the way need some additional assistance with looking at how they exit their business, looking how they recapitalize their business, looking how they structure their business for a future exit that may be years down the road. By engaging business owners on their terms, understanding how they work below the surface, Capital One has a unique competitive advantage in the market.
So, hopefully you've picked up in the last few minutes a few of the concepts, and we know that was quite a fire hose of information, but hopefully it's given you a few insights into what makes business owners tick. I'd really encourage you to think about how then you just communicate with business owners on a day-to-day basis, and how you might have a conversation about risk, for example, is a great, just simple takeaway from this conversation. And the process with Capital One, as Ali described, we've seen it work well with owners who are constantly bombarded with exit planning messages. You might hear, go, this is just another exit planning process. We believe this is unique because the owner is at the center. And it's designed, I have this bass fishing metaphor in my mind. We're casting out lures in ways that attract the natural motivations of the business owner and leaves them in control of the process, and ultimately can achieve excellent outcomes for the wealth management team and for the commercial banking team and for all the components of Capital One that work well with that business owner. And as a result, and we're seeing that work out, they look to Capital One as an entrepreneurial minded institution. So hopefully this has been helpful, and thank you for your time.